good. So the amount of nutrition that you really need to run the body is a lot less because the body just dials down and it can run on a less amount of nutrients. So that's a positive thing. Now, the other thing that happens during autophagy is that you're also cleaning out microbes and fungus and mold and yeast. And to kill off those microbes, your body develops certain oxidants, and you also have antioxidants on the flip side. So your body actually makes things like hydrogen peroxide to kill off microbes, but it also, on the flip side, makes its own antioxidants to actually protect the body against the oxidation. So we have this entire balance. It's only when we have lower amounts of antioxidants and higher amount of oxidants that we get this thing called oxidative stress, which things start breaking down. But when you're doing fasting, you're getting a nice balance of more antioxidants and your body's starting to heal. Now, when you get to 48 hours, you really start to stimulate the stem cells. These are undifferentiated cells. In other words, they're cells that don't have a purpose. So they can turn into this tissue or that tissue depending on what the body needs. So you start to stimulate the stem cell and get more healing and more repair, more anti-aging. You also get decreased risks of certain types of cancer. You get shrinkage of certain tumors. You start making more mitochondria. Now, if you push it and go up to 72 hours, you get even more stimulation of stem cells, okay, and better immune function. But when you actually get into 72 hours or greater, I recommend you do that as a periodic thing, simply because a lot of people going into this have nutritional deficiencies, and if you jump in too fast, you can get a little bit dizzy, you can have some side effects, so you want to gradually do this over a period of time. But those are some general things that happen when you're fasting. I recommend doing intermittent fasting on a regular basis, okay? And probably a good average pattern of doing this would be going 18 hours of fasting with a 6-hour window. So you would eat and then wait 6 hours later and then eat and then fast for 18 hours. This would be a really good pattern to follow. And then you can actually make it more strict over time depending on how you do. Then what you can do is periodic prolonged fasting to achieve additional health benefits, whether it's for your immune system because you have an autoimmune problem, or you just want to look younger with your skin, or you want more brain cells, you want better heart function, better gut function, or let's say you have cancer and you want to improve that. Because one thing that fasting will do is it will increase your resistance to stress. And even if someone's on chemotherapy, it will actually help the body's resistance against chemicals and poisons, which is quite remarkable. Make sure you take your minerals during fasting. So I know a lot of people recommend just doing either water fast, just drinking water, or a dry fast where you're not drinking anything. I recommend doing a water fast with nutrients, just because if you are deficient, you can have problems. So you want your minerals, you want your B vitamins, and you want your salt. Very important. Right around 8 o'clock in the morning, you have the spike in cortisol. And if cortisol spikes, sometimes that can cause your body to make more glucose, and you can have higher blood sugars. And it happens with a lot of people with blood sugar issues. Nothing to worry about. That will improve over time. But if you just add exercise in the morning, that will burn off some of that extra sugar. And if you're fasting, it's not coming from your diet. It's just coming from your liver making glucose, making a little too much because maybe the cortisol is too high. Okay, so just wanted to point it out, and I have videos on that. I'll put a link down below. It's called the Dawn phenomenon. Now, if your LDL, so-called bad cholesterol, which is not really bad, low-density lipoprotein is increased, the reason for this, especially if you're not consuming any type of significant carbohydrates and you're doing fasting, this is increased from a different reason. Think about one of the purposes of LDL. It's to deliver cholesterol to different tissues, right? Well, think about all the things that are happening when your body is fasting. You are going through a major healing process. And cholesterol is the raw material for your cell membranes, for your brain, to make hormones, to make vitamin D, to make bile. 40% of all the cholesterol in your body is there to supply the membrane of your cells, which is essential to protect the cell and allow for things to go in and out of the cell. So maybe one of the reasons why your body might need the cholesterol to be transported through this carrier protein is healing the cellular membranes. Or it could be that it needs to have the raw material to make more hormones. I would not worry about that. If you are concerned, there are various tests that you could do to determine what's happening to this cholesterol, is it doing damage or not, but I would not worry about it. But anyway, I wanted to create a video just to kind of show you what happens to the inside of your body when you're fasting. Thanks for watching. So if you want more knowledge on how to create a healthy body, subscribe now and get daily notifications.
This is the main theme from the finale of Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata. The first movement is probably more famous, but I want to show you something that Beethoven does later on in this movement that I think gets at the heart of what made Beethoven unique among the classical composers. This is the section I'm talking about, beginning in measure 79. This passage is not so mind-blowing to listen to, and it's not particularly fun to perform either. In fact, it's actually kind of weird. But once you start analyzing this passage, you realize that it was written in such a way as to reward careful study. And when the analyst tries to lift the veil on this composition to see how it works, they find Beethoven staring right back at them. This is where we transition back into the main theme. The composer and music theorist Francis Lodowick York noticed something interesting about this passage in his book on counterpoint. He claims that Beethoven composed this section of the sonata using cantus firmus technique and the strict species counterpoint approach of Fuchs's Gradus ad Parnassum, which is a textbook that we know for a fact Beethoven used when studying composition with Haydn and Albrechtsberger. York writes, "The example by Beethoven shows various treatments of a cantus. First, we have the cantus in the position with Haydn, which is a textbook that we counterpoint approach of Fuchs's Gradus ad Parnassum, which is a textbook that we know for a fact Beethoven used when studying composition with Haydn and Albrechtsberger. York writes, "Cantus firmus." He claims that Beethoven composed this section of the sonata using cantus firmus technique and the strict species counterpoint approach of Fuchs's Gradus ad Parnassum, which is a textbook that we know for a fact Beethoven used when studying composition with Haydn and Albrechtsberger. York writes, "The example by Beethoven shows various treatments of a cantus. First, we have the cantus in the upper part with counterpoint mostly in first species in the lower part. Then then the cantus is changed over to the lower part, while the counterpoint is above, first in the fourth species, then in the first, though in quarter notes. Next, the cantus is in the upper voice, but two new voices appear, making a counterpoint in the fourth species. Next, we have the cantus lowest, the tenor in counterpoint of the first species with it, the two upper voices in fourth species. In the next part, we go back to two voices again, having the counterpoint in the third species below, and then above. Now, of course, you wouldn't notice this pattern unless, like York and Beethoven, you had been trained in species counterpoint. So, Beethoven is including a little inside joke for those of us in the know. But it isn't an entirely original joke. Mozart did something similar a few decades earlier in the finale of his G major string quartet.
Орсон по кличке Фортуна. Звучит сексуально.
In Mozart's version, the cantus firmus technique is even easier to spot since it is written out in whole notes, so that it looks visually just like the cantus firmi from a counterpoint exercise. In movies or video games, they call this an Easter egg. Easter eggs work as a kind of wink to those in the audience that get the reference, but the film usually makes perfect sense on its own, whether you notice it or not. Easter eggs are supposed to be hidden and non-essential. So even if the audience doesn't recognize Mozart's reference to species counterpoint, the passage still makes pleasant music. Beethoven's reference is a little more extreme than Mozart's. These variations on a very short theme seem to have almost nothing to do with the preceding music, and the syncopations in the fourth species sections create a kind of herky-jerk texture and lead to very harsh dissonances. Even if we don't recognize the reference to species counterpoint, an enculturated listener would recognize that Beethoven is going out of his way to do something weird and possibly experimental. The music is inviting us to speculate on what Beethoven is up to. Let's take a closer look at the first two cantus firmus settings. York claims that the phrase beginning in measure 79 is first species 1-to-1 rhythmic proportion, and the phrase beginning in measure 83 is syncopated fourth species. That is true as far as the rhythms go, but the voice leading is actually not very idiomatic of species counterpoint. In traditional first species, we prefer stepwise motion to leaps, and this example is nothing but alternating leaps by ascending fourths and descending fifths, so this example is not very melodically fluent. In fourth species counterpoint, suspension dissonances formed by syncopation should always resolve down by step to a consonance, but in this example, that never happens. This raises the question, why would Beethoven go out of his way to reference Fuchs's strict species, only then to break the most important rules of those species? Why give bad examples of the thing that you are referencing? Part of the answer comes when we realize that Beethoven's references to learned topics in music theory did not stop with species counterpoint. The first phrase is also an example of imitation in contrary motion. This is most clear if you ignore the first note in the bass. Then you can see that the pattern of ascending fourths and descending fifths is simply shifted over by half a measure between the right and left hands. The fourth species example is also a kind of imitation, this one a very rare kind, called imitatio in arsen et fessen, meaning imitation between upbeats and downbeats. Friedrich Wilhelm Marburg gave this example of this kind of imitation in his textbook on fugue, which looks quite a bit like Beethoven's passage. The important difference, though, is that Marburg only allows consonant intervals between the two voices, whereas Beethoven allows the voices to clash and create very strong dissonances. Now, you may have noticed that ascending fourths are the inversion of descending fifths, so that if we keep track of the note names of each note of the melody, we can see that it cycles through the circle of fifths within the diatonic key of A flat major. This is called a diatonic interval cycle. The right hand melody moves down the circle of fifths from C to D flat, and the left hand melody moves through the same interval cycle from A flat to B flat. The main theme of Brahms's Fourth Symphony has a very similar design, except that Brahms uses a diatonic interval cycle of thirds rather than fifths. He actually cycles through the pattern twice, first in the first 4 measures from B down to B, and then over the next 14 measures he cycles backwards from E up to E. But getting back to Beethoven, this interval cycle raises another question. York claimed that the right hand cantus firmus was transferred to the left hand for the second phrase, and that the counterpoint voice switched hands as well, sort of like what happens in a Bach invention. But there is another way of looking at it, where the material does not switch hands. The cantus firmus begins with an ascending fourth from C to F, and the counterpoint begins with a descending fifth. But if we keep track of the note names, we see that the notes don't actually change between measures 79 and 83. Beethoven just inverts every other note up or down 1 octave, which turns the right-hand melody into a transposed version of the left-hand melody, and vice versa. Now let's get back to those dissonant suspensions that don't resolve down by step. How is Beethoven able to get away with that, while everything still sounds smooth? Well, there is one exception that Fuchs gives in Gradus ad Parnassum to the rule about resolving suspensions by step. He says that you can include an intervening note, known as an embellishing tone in fifth species, in between the dissonance and its resolution. So in this example, the suspended 7th C does resolve down by step to B flat, but the resolution is delayed by an embellishing tone. This just so happens to form exactly the interval pattern of a descending fifth followed by an ascending fourth that Beethoven uses for his theme. So this is very close to being a good explanation. The problem is that Beethoven's bass line also moves to a new note before the resolution happens. And so we get this chain of stumbling suspensions and partial resolutions. The embellishing tone is allowed in strict counterpoint because it evokes a 3-voice chordal texture. The note F in this example comes about by motion between the top voice and an inner voice from the implied harmony. This is actually going to be the key to understanding Beethoven's entire design. To show what I mean, here's a simple example of 3-voice counterpoint with 4th species 7/6 suspensions in the top voice. The lower 2 voices move in parallel tenths. Now I'm going to add a note to the bass line on every upbeat, at the same moment that each suspension resolves in the top voice. This is not allowed in strict 2-voice counterpoint, but it is quite common in traditional thorough-bass, and in some combined species exercises in 3 and 4 voices. The new bass notes form consonances with the cantus firmus on the downbeat, and consonances with the resolutions on the upbeat. Fort and Gilbert in their textbook would call this a linear intervallic pattern. In this case, it's a sequential chord progression of dissonant seventh chords moving down through the circle of fifths. All Beethoven did was to take this very normal chord progression in three voices and to merge the top two voices into a single voice by arpeggiating between the two. Lo and behold, this ends up forming the same pattern of descending fifths and ascending fourths that the bass line is made out of, which is why the two resulting voices can be put in canonic imitation. When Beethoven thickens the texture in measure 87, he just doubles the lower voice in parallel thirds, which happen to end up forming the exact same melodic notes of the right hand. And the same thing happens in measure 91. The texture is thicker, but there isn't actually any more harmony than there was in the two-voice version. When we get to the variations in third species, the running scales might at first look unrelated to the circle of fifths motive, but upon closer inspection, we can see that the descending fifths land on every strong beat. C is still counterpointed against A flat, F is still counterpointed against D flat, etc. When Beethoven's contemporaries called him a master of motivic development, this is the kind of thing they were talking about. He has built this passage out of the simplest possible tonal materials, the circle of fifths and a stepwise scale. And he's also shown how these two seemingly different things are actually two versions of the same motive, and that they share the same underlying counterpoint. Finally, I want to leave you with one last question. This entire passage can be seen as a compositional essay on the topic of the circle of fifths. But how is this section at all related to the rest of the movement? Why was Beethoven so obsessed with pursuing the counterpoint of descending fifths and ascending fourths to begin with? I think the best answer is that the motive comes from the main theme of the rondo itself. Beethoven zoomed in on these few notes from his main theme and developed them systematically and rigorously in the middle section.
Офигеть, откуда у вас столько?
Что читаете?
Ты, твою мать, никак не привыкну. Вот это.
Где взяли?
На Авито, конечно же. Я Авито доверяю, Авито кайф мне доставляет. О, блин, это стихи. А включи что-нибудь про творчество.
Внимание на экран.
Не поеду за границу на таиландский я курорт. Чтоб не холодно мне было, на Авито я купила себе платье и сапожки. Ну, еще там всякого по мелочи, ну, там для дома, себе, на подарки.
Ха-ха, класс. А можно песню?
Ну, ладно, уговорил.
Я захочу, ты мне доставляешь, значит я получу.
This is one of the many instances of the Bach motif, where J.S. Bach inscribed his own name as a musical cipher into the notes of his music. The reason why the 4 letters of Bach's name can be translated into note names has to do with the 3 hexachords that I went over in the last video. Here are the hexachords from the key of D minor. The names of the notes in the German language actually come from these hexachords. In German, they use the same note names A through G that we do in English, but they also go one further and add the note name H for the note we would call B natural. B and B flat both occur in the larger hexachordal system, so the German musicians who came up with their note names chose 2 different names for B and B flat. All 4 letters of Bach's name can therefore be transcribed into musical notes. And even though the notes were produced in a somewhat arbitrary translation, Bach was able to harmonize and counterpoint this 4-note motif in several different, highly creative ways over the course of his career. Despite the title, this video is not going to be about only the Bach motif translation. Bach was able, though the notes were produced in a somewhat arbitrary translation, Bach was able to harmonize and counterpoint this 4-note motif in several different, highly creative ways over the course of his career. Despite the title, this video is not going to be about only the Bach motif, but also about how to use any irregular or highly chromatic fugue subject. So this video is sort of a sequel to the last one. I'll go ahead and spoil the moral at the end of the video, which is going to be that basically any scrap of melody could be used as a fugue subject. Not everything will make for a good fugue subject, but that is a different question. The Bach motif makes for an irregular fugue subject in at least 2 ways. First, the subject begins on B flat, which is scale degree 6 in D minor, the key of this example. All of the fugue subjects we looked at in the previous video on subjects and answers only began on either scale degree 1 or 5. This was one of the questions that Schubert brought to Simon Zector when he met with him in the fall of 1828 for a lesson on counterpoint and fugue. Schubert came prepared with a series of fugue subjects he had written that began on every possible diatonic scale degree. Here we see one of Schubert's subjects that begins on E, scale degree 3 in the key of C major. It turns out that there is no rule that states that a fugue subject must begin on scale degree 1 or 5. It just so happens that most of them do. But there is nothing particularly difficult about fugue subjects that begin on a different scale degree. You simply transpose the subject from the tonic hexachord into the dominant hexachord, as here, or vice versa. Notice that the only solfege syllable that Schubert changed was this note G in the subject, which was changed to C, when it should have been a D. Since scale degree 5 was treated as a prominent goal of melodic motion early in the subject, that motion should be redirected towards scale degree 1 in the answer to create a melodic balance. So Schubert makes this adjustment to create a tonal answer. All of that should be reviewed from the last video in the series. So the fact that the Bach motif does not necessarily begin on scale degree 1 or 5 is not any kind of problem. In fact, it could be used as a subject in several different keys, which we will see in a moment. second irregularity of the Bach motif is its chromaticism. Bach had a reputation for composing highly chromatic fugue subjects, like this one from the final fugue of the first book of the Well-Tempered Clavier, where the subject touches on all 12 notes of the chromatic scale. This works almost like a summary for the whole book, which moved systematically through all 24 major and minor keys. Notice that Bach groups these chromatic notes into two-note pairs separated by a half step, which is an organization that resembles the four notes of the Bach motif.
Я ощущаю чье-то присутствие. От режиссера Гильермо дель Торо.
С этой книгой легко натворить бед.
Не ты дурачишь людей, Стар. Они сами себя дурачат.
Вас не так уж трудно раскусить.
Заходите!
Or consider this fugue subject by Scarlatti, the notes of which, according to legend, he transcribed as his cat walked across his keyboard. If Bach's name had been longer, he might have ended up with an equally random group of notes for his musical insignia. Both of these examples make for intimidating fugue subjects because of their chromaticism. But, as we will see, there are common tricks for interpreting chromatic notes in terms of the hexachordal solfege syllables that render them entirely manageable. Getting back to the Bach motif, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach composed this riddle canon using the notes of his family name. He left a very suggestive clue printed above the canon that relates back to the hexachordal solfege syllables. Fa, mi, and mi, fa is all of music. This clue turns out to be relevant for understanding the Bach motif in many of its different contexts, not just in this riddle canon. If you want to solve the canon yourself, I'll leave that to you. The solution I came up with is available on the Patreon page. Here's a fugue that was probably composed by Bach, although its authenticity is in doubt, that uses the BACH motif in the key of C major, and it shows one of the most straightforward ways to set the motif. The first two notes, B flat and A, can be interpreted as Fa and Mi in the subdominant hexachord built on F, while the second pair of notes form Fa and Mi in the dominant hexachord built on G. When the third voice enters with the subject in the second system, we can see that the first Fa note is interpreted as the chordal seventh of a C dominant seventh chord. Chordal sevenths resolving down by step are a very common way to set a pair of Fa, Mi notes. In the second pair of notes, the note C is harmonized as the root of a C major triad that progresses down by half step to the third of a G major triad. So here we see the first Fa, Mi harmonized with root motion down by fifth, and in the second, harmonized by root motion up by fifth. Next example, Bach sets the motif in the key of B flat, so that the subject begins on scale degree 1. If we peek down at the entry of the tenor voice in the second system, we can see that Bach harmonizes both of the Fa-Mi pairs the same way, as the root of a triad moving to the third of a triad up the circle of fifths, just like we saw in the previous example. In the first case, this is a B flat triad moving to an F triad, and in the second case, C minor moves to G major. The second measure of the fugue subject is also made out of descending half-step pairs. Fa mi in a hexachord built on C, then in one built on F, B flat, and E flat, moving down the circle of fifths. In order to harmonize these fa mi's moving down the circle of fifths, Bach treats them as chordal sevenths resolving to chordal thirds. He also chooses the most direct kind of counterpoint for chordal sevenths, which is the half-step resolving upwards, mi-fa instead of fa-mi. These mi-fa pairs are, in essence, the soprano cadence that we learned about back in the videos on counterpoint in triads and seventh chords. This brings us back to the example from the beginning of the video, where Bach places the motif, this time in the context of the key of G minor. Bach's harmonization, in this case, treats the first B flat as the third of a G minor triad, and the A as the root of an A minor triad in first inversion. The C is treated as the seventh of a dominant seventh chord, and the B that it resolves to is the third of a G triad. And in our last example of the Bach motif, Johann Georg Albertsberger treats it in the key of G minor. The first B flat is treated as the seventh of a C-sharp diminished seventh chord, which resolves down by step to the fifth of a D minor triad. C is then also treated as a chordal seventh that resolves down by step. These examples show that even a somewhat random group of notes, like the BACH motif, can serve as a fugue subject in many different keys. We saw examples in C major, B flat major, D minor, and G minor, and I'm sure there are other harmonizations of the subject that would work equally well in other key areas. Can you come up with a harmonization of the Bach motif in the key of, let's say, F major? I will leave you with another musical cipher, this one invented by Simon Zector during that lesson with Schubert that I mentioned earlier in the video. He gave Schubert this fugue subject as a homework. He wanted Schubert to compose a fugue based on the notes derived from his own name. In German, the note E flat is pronounced S, CH, and there is no U, so he leaves a rest, B, E, and then another rest for the R and the T. Unfortunately, Schubert died within 9 days of this lesson with Zector, so he never composed that fugue. Simon Zector completed the fugue and published it as his Opus 43 in memoriam of Schubert.